The first WrestleMania was in the books, the first of dozens to follow. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T stood tall in front of a frenzied Madison Square Garden crowd to end the afternoon, but it was Vince McMahon behind the curtain that stood taller. His WWF had hit a whopping home run with an event whose name would soon join Hogan's among household and mainstream vernacular. Already lords of cable, TBS tenure aside, McMahon and Company delivered the highest grossing closed-circuit wrestling card to date. Part of its success could be attributed to an extreme amount of mainstream promotion, as Hogan and the Horde appeared on various national TV programs to get the word out. One of these shows was a popular late-night hit that may have lost some of its luster through the years, but could still capture the cultural zeitgeist of the day, and it still had a sizable following. At 11:30 p.m. on Saturday night, March 30th, less than 14 hours before WrestleMania's start time, Hogan and Mr. T co-hosted Saturday Night Live from inside Studio 8H at New York's Rockefeller Center. WrestleMania hype was evident throughout the 90-minute broadcast as Hogan and T shared the screen with Billy Crystal, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and Christopher Guest in a handful of comedic bits. Piper and Orton even sent in some pre-taped trash talk, making this SNL the first true WrestleMania go-home show. The SNL showrunner at the time was longtime NBC executive Dick Ebersol, but not for long. After 4 years at the helm, differences over the show's direction, as well as a desire for a less taxing schedule, led Ebersol out of Studio 8H, opening the door for SNL creator Lorne Michaels to reclaim his old position the following season. Ebersol's medium was late-night television, with his saving of a wounded SNL among his two big successes, the other being NBC's Friday Night Videos, a network counter to the MTV craze. An admitted fan of Tuesday Night Titans, Ebersol pondered if off-the-wall, outside-the-box pro wrestling could play just as well to the insomnia crowd. He saw what the WWF had done on cable, but could they match that success on terrestrial TV? Sometime after Hogan and T's hosting appearance, Ebersol pitched to Vince the idea of bringing the WWF to NBC. Network president Brandon Tartikoff greenlit a pilot broadcast, but only after the ratings-conscious boss was assured that they could get Cyndi Lauper for the show. On Friday night, May 10th, the WWF circus descended upon Long Island's Nassau Coliseum for a TV taping, with the broadcast airing the following night in SNL's normal time slot. This was the maiden episode of Saturday night's main event, and all the stars were on hand. Hogan, once more backed by network star Mr. T, defeated Orton by DQ in the WWF title match. Lauper was there, watching as Richter vanquished Perma-rival Moolah, and both Orndorff and George Steele turned babyface during the taping, after falling out with their bad guy peers. When the 8.8 TV rating was revealed, the highest for the time slot since SNL's early years, Tartikoff told Ebersol he wanted more WWF specials for the year ahead. Not only did NBC pick up a new hit, but Vince received an education. To that point, even the biggest WWF events were starkly lit affairs, and TV veteran Ebersol was unimpressed by the Stone Age level production value. He was going to change the way WWF shot television. As was written in Sex, Lies and Headlocks, there would be no more showing up at an arena with a single truck carrying a ring and some lights. Ebersol wanted 4 cameras at ringside with boom mics to catch the grunts and groans that usually went unheard. He wanted state-of-the-art lighting rigs. He wanted concert-quality sound. In the wee hours after the taping, Ebersol and his crew pieced together the broadcast version at his Manhattan studio. In the light of day, he showed the finished product to Vince and Linda, and the WWF head was bowled over by what he saw. Wrestling had its own SNL, bolstered by the most compelling late-night stars since Eddie Murphy took us to Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. Like SNL, the WWF cast was prone to changes. That June, Ken Patera was sentenced to 2 years in prison for a 1984 assault on several police officers in Wisconsin. The popular Sergeant Slaughter left suddenly the prior December due to a number of monetary disputes, and Jimmy Snuka parted ways with the WWF as well. In came new faces. Jim Neidhart debuted earlier in 1985 and post-WrestleMania was teamed with brother-in-law Bret Hart, who had previously languished at the bottom of cards as a flavorless face. Now dubbed the Hart Foundation, managed appropriately by Jimmy Hart, the treacherous two were perfect foils for fellow Stampede alums Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith, now called the British Bulldogs. Another new duo was the Killer Bees, Jim Brunzell and Brian Blair, who made for a highly reliable mid-card tandem. A curious debut occurred earlier in 1985, in the form of the 6'4" Lady Maxine, a punkish giantess inspired by Mad Max Apocalyptica. The German-born prospect was intended to be a long-term rival for Richter, but quickly left the WWF for a handful of reasons, including falling out with trainer Moolah over percentages of Maxine's earnings. Former NWA World Heavyweight Champion Terry Funk arrived in June, ornery and entertaining as ever, and former enhancement talent R.T. Reynolds was recostumed as Corporal Kirchner, a fairly obvious go at having a military-themed wrestler in Slaughter's absence. Later that summer saw the debut of King Tonga, the man best known today as Certified Killing Machine Haku. Canadian powerhouse Dino Bravo arrived at the same time, giving the WWF a proven draw for their trips to a new touring stop, Quebec. For the same reason, Jacques and Raymond Rougeau came along shortly thereafter. The Biggest Prize acquisition debuted on June 17th, and any world title dreams for him weren't the slightest bit far-fetched. On that date, undercard wrestler Aldo Marino lost in under 3 minutes to the sleek yet primal Macho Man Randy Savage. 10 days removed from succumbing to Jerry Lawler in a loser leaves town match in Memphis, Savage arrived in the WWF amid heavy fanfare, billed as pro wrestling's top free agent, which is hard to argue against. So coveted a star was Savage that every heel manager was vying to sign him. In the end, the Macho Man spurned them all in favor of the quiet, doe-eyed Miss Elizabeth, his real-life wife. The contrast between the two was incredible, as Savage's shameless bombast and pomp drowned out any noise the humble, mostly muted Elizabeth could have made. And this was the paradox of Savage. He was the coolest of cool heels, but even his biggest fan wanted him to let his timid valet enjoy some of the spotlight. An industrious year for the WWF continued onward. The US Express regained the tag titles from Sheik and Volkov in June, but then later dropped them in August to Valentine and Beefcake, now christened the Dream Team. Along the way, Valentine dropped the IC title to Santana inside of a steel cage on July 6th. There in Baltimore, Santana settled the grudge with an inventive finish. As the challenger climbed over the cage wall, Valentine tried for the door. A descending Santana was close enough to kick the open door into Valentine's moose-like skull, sending the champion crumpling to the mat as Tito victoriously dropped to the arena floor. 2 days after Santana's win, a new honor debuted: the King of the Ring. An untelevised event, the inaugural tournament was held in front of 23,000 fans at Massachusetts Sullivan Stadium and featured a rare all-heel final in which Morocco outlasted Sheik. If it's any consolation to Sheik, it's that he became a TV star of a different sort starting in September. That's when Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling entered CBS's Saturday morning cartoon lineup. The animated show was an extremely light-hearted take on the WWF's top stars, with Hogan, JYD, Santana, Andre, Hillbilly, Richter, and Albano repping the good guy side, while Piper, Sheik, Volkov, Fuji, Stud, and Moolah, drawn to replace intended character Lady Maxine, acted as counterparts. The wrestlers themselves didn't provide voices, though it's interesting to note that Hogan was voiced by Everybody Loves Raymond star Brad Garrett, while Junkyard Dog's narrator was James Avery, better known as Uncle Philip Banks from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Explain to any wrestler or wrestling fan 2 years earlier that some of the industry's top stars would eventually be immortalized in Saturday morning cartoon form, and you'd have gotten some funny looks. Professional wrestling changed so much between 1983 and 1985 that stopping to consider it all is head-spinning in and of itself. And more changes were coming. Not content with simply sitting on top of the pecking order, Vince McMahon and the WWF sought thorough industrial dominance, going places no wrestling entity had ever gone before. A cartoon was but one unique accomplishment. There was more treasure in the unexplored seas, and Vince knew it. In plumbing the depths for more gold, the WWF would find itself living in strange days, and times both tremendous and turbulent. But this was life for the still growing World Wrestling Federation. Rock and wrestling was in full swing, and it didn't seem like the music was ever going to stop. In the autumn of 1985, the band continued playing on in the World Wrestling Federation. The playlist was ever fluid, with more contemporary tunes stacking the lineup. Saturday night's main event kicked off to Animotion's Obsession, while Phil Collins's Take Me Home served as closing theme. A face-turned Paul Orndorff briefly used Van Zant's I'm a Fighter for his entrances, and Tag Team the Killer Bees entered to Loverboy's The Kid Is Hot Tonight for a time. But the most important musical revelation came from a veteran guitarist and producer, one with a connection to Cyndi Lauper. Rick Derringer came of age in the music business in the 1960s and had worked with many top industry figures over the ensuing 2 decades. To an organization looking to both keep up with musical trends and expand its commercial output, Derringer was a strong choice for producer. And what Derringer produced, alongside Lauper, David Wolf, and composer Jim Steinman, was the Wrestling Album, a 10-track set in which many of the WWF's top stars took turns playing studio idol. Memorable songs included Hillbilly Jim's Don't Go Messin' With a Country Boy, Mean Gene's earnest cover of Little Richard's Tutti Frutti, and Junkyard Dog's Grab Them Cakes, which turned out to be a cover of an obscure 1981 recording of a Captain Chameleon song. There was also Land of a Thousand Dancers, complemented by a music video of virtually everyone in the WWF family singing a solo part, or in Orndorff's case, kissing their own biceps in lieu of clapping. Most of the songs were quite tongue-in-cheek, a demonstration of the professionally amateurish dualism that was the WWF's core ingredient. But one Wrestling Album track proved to have far greater lasting appeal than just being a chucklesome novelty. That autumn, Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda of the US Express eschewed Born in the USA in favor of a Derringer-recorded track with much more American pride in the lyrics. Weeks later, however, Windham departed from the company, allowing for the song to be transferred to a different wrestler, Hulk Hogan, who jettisoned Eye of the Tiger in the process. Real American was the third track on the wrestling album, and it was an innately catchy ode to patriotic spirit with its bold guitar riff and thudding percussion. And of course, because it was the 80s, there had to be a cheesy music video. Though even the most ardent Hogan hater has to be somewhat charmed by the sight of a superimposed Hulkster strumming his guitar at various US landmarks. Meanwhile, on the network, Hogan remained a landmark attraction, as evidenced by his appearances on Saturday night's main event. A later beginning to the 1985 SNL season gave NBC the opportunity to plug the WWF in for a pair of earlier autumn dates. On October 5th, the second ever Saturday night's main event episode was broadcast and featured the legitimate wedding of behemoth good old boy Uncle Elmer to his sweetheart Joyce Stasco. During the ceremonial kiss, commentator Jesse Ventura uttered one of his most memorable lines when he said, "They look like two carp in the Mississippi River going after the same piece of corn." The same night, Hogan vanquished Nikolai Volkov in a flag match to retain the WWF title, before later making the save for Andre the Giant and Tony Atlas, after the two won a tag bout over King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd via DQ. The angle set up Hogan and Andre as the ultimate tandem, as they would face Bundy and Studd at the ensuing Saturday night special. 4 weeks later, on November 1st, Hogan and Andre got their own DQ win over Studd and Bundy. Somewhat strangely, while the October 5th telecast stood comparable to the premiere with an 8.3 TV rating, the Hogan-Andre showcase fell to a 6.3 rating. Despite that diminished number, the WWF-NBC union was hardly in jeopardy, and that weaker 6.3 rating would prove over time to be an anomaly. Away from the mainstream, Hogan ferried the WWF belt into new territories, like Hiram Bithorn Stadium in San Juan, Puerto Rico. On October 19th, Hogan did battle with Studd at the outdoor venue, fighting through a torrential downpour that kicked up mid-match. When Hulk wasn't flexing his patriot muscle on members of the Heenan family, he was still trying to solve the Roddy Piper puzzle. The Hot Rod couldn't win the title from Hogan, while Hogan couldn't pin the vociferous nuisance. And it was more of the same sort of stalemate come Thursday, November 7th, when the WWF staged its first true foray into the pay-per-view market. The Wrestling Classic was staged in front of 14,000 fans at the Rosemont Horizon in suburban Chicago. The venue played host to a one-night 16-man elimination tournament, while Hogan vs. Piper was the lone non-tournament bout. Though pay-per-view was really in its infancy in 1985, the Wrestling Classic was considered a disappointment, managing only 47,000 buys. The fact that the event was not particularly story-driven was one issue, as was the fact that it was held on a Thursday night. Plans to present a follow-up pay-per-view in January were shelved, but the WWF would indeed revisit pay-per-view not too long after. As for the card, it really was the Randy Savage show. The disputatious Macho Man shined against Ricky Steamboat and Dynamite Kid in exceedingly short matches, before losing via countout to the Junkyard Dog in the finals. For the Hogan-Piper title bout, it was another unsatisfying finish. A DQ win for Hulk after just 7 minutes. It marked the last high-profile singles match between the two until meeting in a different company over 10 years later. And it wasn't even the most newsworthy Piper-related story of the time. On the October 26th episode of Championship Wrestling, the Rowdy One presided over his usual Piper's Pit soapbox, welcoming a rather curious guest, a lower mid-card journeyman named Rick McGraw, nickname Quick Draw. Piper had hosted various undercard wrestlers before, humiliating them for their diminished standing, and McGraw looked to be no different. This time, however, the script flipped. Instead of getting bullied by the star, it was McGraw that got the verbal upper hand on Piper, leaving Piper searching for excuses when he was asked why he didn't wrestle on TV all that much and why he needed a bodyguard in Cowboy Bob Orton. Not only did McGraw have Piper scrambling for answers, but he ended the segment by smacking the top villain. For Hot Rod haters, what a treat it was to see Piper get put in his place by an unlikely individual. The next time the two met, however, was anything but a treat. On the November 2nd broadcast, Piper defeated McGraw via referee stoppage. The 5'7" wrestler did all he could to stand up physically to the veritable schoolyard bully, but was no match as Piper spiked him with all manner of neckbreaker, brainbuster, and DDT, leaving McGraw unable to defend himself. A still frothing Piper left the ringside area as McGraw was eventually loaded onto a stretcher. It would be the last time that Rick McGraw appeared on WWF television. In a horribly morbid coincidence, McGraw passed away the day before the match aired, succumbing to a heart attack at the age of 30. Many have attributed McGraw's untimely passing to abuse of Placidil, a sedative. Because of the narrow timeline of events, the prevalence of kayfabe, the way news traveled in a pre-internet age, and how the angle was set up, many WWF fans had drawn a disturbing conclusion: that Piper's brutal and callous beatdown of McGraw must have been what caused the young wrestler's death. The match may have aired on November 2nd, but was actually filmed on October 22nd, a full 11 nights earlier. McGraw actually wrestled at house shows since the Piper bout, his final match a loss to Iron Mike Sharp on October 28th. Nonetheless, there were no message boards or social media outlets to inform the wider fanbase. And so, the WWF was besieged with angry calls and letters concerning Piper, an apparent killer. The WWF went on to stage a memorial show for McGraw on December 16th before 2,400 fans in McGraw's native Charlotte. Piper worked the card, as did Hogan and Andre. Eventually, most of those confused by the blurred lines of a protected industry did come to realize that Piper had no part in McGraw's unfortunate passing. Life, as it does, moved on in the WWF. With 1985 winding down, McMahon and the rest of the brass could take stock of the most unusual year in the New York-based promotion's rich history. Or they focus on doing what they'd been doing for the prior 2 years: expand rapidly and aggressively and adapt to the wild changes that they would continue to create. The first WrestleMania had established the WWF as a winning team, filled to the edges with all-stars and future Hall of Famers. But just because you were in the who's who, it didn't mean your occupancy was permanent. On Monday, November 25th at Madison Square Garden, Women's Champion Wendy Richter defended her title against the Masked Spider Lady, somebody Richter had worked with in matches ranging back to August. But on this night, somebody different was under the hood. In the run-up to the match, Richter found herself at odds with Vince McMahon. She felt her payoffs weren't equal to her standing as the women's champion going on 8 months, and also claimed she received no royalties from her merchandise. She later claimed, "I was being paid what the people in opening matches were being paid." Additionally, as recently as that day in the Garden, Richter was also asked to sign a new contract with the WWF, which she wouldn't sign until her agent had a chance to look over it. Following Richter's refusal to put the pen to paper at the WWF's behest, McMahon enacted a quietly concocted plan. Richter stepped into the ring with the Spider Lady that night in the Garden, and quickly realized that her opponent was not the usual woman in the role. Instead, it was the fabulous Moolah, whom Richter had seen backstage earlier in the day. She found it odd that Moolah would be at a show she wasn't booked on, but thought little of it until now. The two worked aggressively with each other as a confused Richter carried on with a match she was told she was winning. That is, until the masked Moolah performed an inside cradle and the referee fast counted to 3 even though Richter clearly kicked out. In fact, Richter tried to continue the match thinking the bell was erroneous, but it wasn't. Moolah was unmasked during the extracurricular brawl, and the Garden crowd were just as confused as Richter was. Retroactively known as the original Screwjob, McMahon had confabbed with Moolah to get the title off of Richter. In shock at the conspiracy, Richter left MSG immediately after her match, later saying she hailed a cab to the airport still in her ring gear. And Richter never again worked for the WWF. Nor did she ever speak again to Moolah. And the connection to Richter's celebrity compliment functionally ceased the following March, when the WWF presented its first ever Slammy Awards on MTV. The tongue-in-cheek Grammys send-up was as comedically unfiltered as one might expect, though it marked the end of the WWF's business with both MTV and Cyndi Lauper, who won the Slammy for Best Producer. The weekend of Richter's loss was one of strange live event occurrences. The previous Friday night at the Philadelphia Spectrum, David Sammartino lost a match to Ron Shaw, who was generally an enhancement talent on WWF's syndicated shows. What made the loss unusual was that Sammartino was said to have submitted to a bear hug applied by Shaw, because he actually did. Sammartino later claimed he was sick of McMahon and the backstage machinations, so he threw the match. The second-generation wrestler finished up with the WWF after that, but did briefly return in the spring of 1986. The deeply undercard Sammartino leaving ultimately left no dent in the WWF, whose roster was in a constant state of flux as it was. Debuting at the time was the ever-powerful Hercules Hernandez, originally managed by classy Freddie Blassie. A regular in Mid-South and Florida, Hercules stood out from the pack with his impressive physique and wild mane of caveman hair. Another powerhouse on the Federation prowl was Ted Arcidi, the first known individual to bench press 700 pounds in an official competition. With no prior wrestling experience, Arcidi hit the WWF ring that December, squashing a number of hapless foes. Dusty Rhodes' protege Dan Spivey arrived in the WWF in late 1985, and the 6'7" former football player replaced Wyndham in the US Express. Another attempt at replacement came in the form of Samoa-born C.V. Offey, who was dubbed Superfly Offey and billed as Jimmy Snuka's cousin. Fans once took to the now-absent Snuka, but Offey, not so much. Capitalizing on Uncle Elmer and Hillbilly Jim's relative popularity, the WWF supplemented the good old boys with relatives. First up, Cousin Jr., played by one-time WWF enhancement talent Lanny Keane. Eventually replacing Jr. was 300-pound Cousin Luke, the quietest of the jolly bunch. Former NWA World Heavyweight Champion Dory Funk Jr. came aboard, teaming with brother Terry. Though in his mid-40s at the time, Dory, renamed Hoss Funk for some reason, still had something to offer inside the ring as a crafty veteran. One signing that didn't happen, but very well could have, was that of pro wrestling's most popular tag team. Animal and Hawk of the Road Warriors oozed testosterone out of their face-painted pores, winning over fans through the no-nonsense manner in which they destroyed the opposition. Having Black Sabbath's Iron Man as their theme music didn't really hurt either, though. With manager Paul Ellering at their side, the Warriors mowed down competitors in Georgia, All Japan, and the AWA. Soon, the big boys were calling. The reigning AWA World Tag Team Champions at the time, Animal and Hawk wanted to work for Jim Crockett Jr. in Charlotte, and willfully took a meeting with McMahon to try and leverage guaranteed deals out of the Carolina promoter, after word would get out that they'd met with Vince. Animal admitted that if McMahon ended up making he and Hawk some Godfather-esque offer, they'd have been just as happy signing with the WWF. But when McMahon wouldn't offer guaranteed contracts, Roberts, the Warriors and Vince parted as gentlemen. The duo ultimately got what they wanted out of Crockett, so the meeting with Vince did what it was intended to do. The signing with the most long-term potential slid into the WWF in March of 1986, mere days after losing the Mid-South television title to Dick Slater, and he would spend the next 6 years weaving some unforgettable tales. Jake the Snake Roberts has long been referred to as a master of psychology. Indeed, his calm yet foreboding soliloquies have played storyline havoc with the minds of his many rivals, just as they left wrestling audiences spellbound. The way Roberts could tease anything, such as a treacherous act or the employment of pet python Damien, made him one of pro wrestling's most gifted speakers, with never a wasted syllable. And even at his most insidious, many fans found Roberts too cool to boo. He may have been the devil, but this was the era of Ozzy and Slayer. So valuable a signing was well-traveled Roberts that he made the WrestleMania 2 card just 5 weeks after his promotional debut. And indeed, the cast of characters filling out the 12-match lineup was the most colourful assortment McMahon had put together to this point. Just as ambitious as the lineup was the location. Or should that be locations, plural? Wanting to make WrestleMania as big a spectacle as possible, McMahon decided to spread out the melodrama, holding the card in 3 different venues in 3 different cities across 3 different time zones in one night. Crockett's Starrcade in November was held in 2 locations, Greensboro and Atlanta, so perhaps McMahon felt he needed to top his biggest threat. Especially since Crockett was now challenging the WWF by running St. Louis the same nights they were. Subtitled What the World Has Come To, WrestleMania 2 put on 4 of its dozen matches at Long Island's Nassau Coliseum, 4 at Chicago's Rosemont Horizon, and 4 at the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena. This required precariously balancing the trio of events, so that those who wouldn't get to see Hogan defend the WWF title wouldn't feel at all cheated with what they got served instead. And if the matches weren't enough, there was going to be a glut of celebrities stretched across the 3 sites. Because there were 3 different events, 3 different commentary teams were required, and the WWF got pretty creative with them, as each broadcast group would be supplemented by a female celebrity. In New York, Vince McMahon was joined by Kate and Ali co-star Susan St. James, whose husband was the very Dick Ebersol that helped create Saturday night's main event. Over in Chicago, former That's Incredible hostess Kathy Lee Crosby joined Gorilla Monsoon, Mean Gene Okerlund, and for one match Big Cat Ernie Ladd, and stationed with Jesse Ventura and Lord Alfred Hayes in LA was Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. And the celebrity habitation didn't end there. Genuine stars were on hand, including comedian Joan Rivers, volcanic baseball manager Tommy Lasorda, and legendary singer Ray Charles, whose stirring rendition of America the Beautiful may just be the finest in all of WrestleMania history. There were even one-hit wonders on display in the form of fast food pitch persons Clara Pella of Wendy's Where's the Beef fame, and the mononymous Herb from Burger King's ill-fated Where's Herb campaign. Don't ask. While these familiar faces were employed as skyrockets to the gawking passerby, the brighter lights were on the stars between the ropes, a gallery of the Federation's hungry present, and by extension, its promising future. Roberts himself had a showcase match with veteran wrestler and former football star George Wells in what would have been little more than a TV match today. A similar match pitted ascending Ricky the Dragon Steamboat against Hercules. Originally, Steamboat was planned to wrestle Bret the Hitman Hart, still one half of the nefarious Hart Foundation. Plans changed, however, but as consolation, Steamboat and Hart both put together a lost classic at Boston Garden the prior month. Uncle Elmer, at the tail end of WWF's mid-80s country boy fascination, was matched up with a now singles Adrian Adonis. But Adonis was no longer the rough-and-tumble New York biker he once portrayed. Late in 1985, Adonis began shifting away from the roughneck persona. Borrowing a few pages from the playbooks of exotic Adrian Street and gorgeous George, Adonis bleached his hair blonde and accessorized with garish makeup, dresses, scarves, and leg warmers while wrestling in blandly pink trunks and boots. The fact that Adonis's weight had noticeably ballooned over the previous months made him look entirely different from the man that once teamed with Ventura and Dick Murdoch. Now dubbed Adorable Adrian Adonis, the former WWF Tag Team Champion made it clear what his character was supposed to be when he unveiled the new gimmick on Piper's Pit, telling Roddy, "I did jump out of the closet, and there were no brooms behind me." Given the time frame, some of the public attitudes of the time, and the fact that Adonis was still a heel, it became obvious that this was not going to be a flattering portrayal at all. WrestleMania 2 was further equipped with some mid-card grudge matches, including Corporal Kirchner versus Nikolai Volkov in a flag match, Tito Santana and Junkyard Dog versus the Funks, and Paul Orndorff against Don Morocco. There were 3 mid-card title bouts. The Fabulous Moolah would defend her ill-gotten women's title against Velvet McIntyre of Ireland. The British Bulldogs, accompanied by the frankly amazing duo of Captain Lou Albano and Ozzy Osbourne, had one last chance to defeat the innocuous Dream Team, the reigning tag team champions. Intercontinental Champion Randy Savage, who'd won the title from Santana at Boston Garden in February after clocking in with the dreaded mysterious foreign object, would have all he could handle in the form of George Steele. Savage didn't take kindly to Steele's simpleton-like affection for Miss Elizabeth, all the while continuing to aggressively upstage his valet in chauvinistic fashion. And to top that all off, each of the 3 cities had a major attraction. For New York, Roddy Piper and Mr. T would once again duke it out, this time in a boxing match. In the Windy City, a 20-man battle royal was put together featuring recognizable WWF faces like Andre Studd and Bruno, as well as a handful of NFL stars, most notably the popular tank-like William Refrigerator Perry of the hometown Chicago Bears, fresh off trouncing the New England Patriots 46-10 in a one-sided Super Bowl 20. But out in Los Angeles was the main event, as WWF champion Hogan would face the 450-pound King Kong Bundy inside the brand new blue barred steel cage. To set up the match, Bundy attacked Hogan with Morocco's help during the most recent Saturday night's main event, all but destroying Hulk's ribs with several corner avalanches followed by grounded splashes. All this mayhem and majesty set the stage for WrestleMania 2 on April 7th, 1986, the only Monday Mania to date. The biggest question of all seemed to be which of the 3 locations could claim the hottest ticket. Almost inarguably, it wasn't Long Island. After Morocco and Orndorff brawled to a truncated double countout, Savage narrowly defeated Steele in something more like a melee than a match, and then Roberts put away Wells in a bout most known for its aftermath, where Jake wrapped Damien around his woozy opponent and Wells messily slobbered in a truly disquieting visual. The boxing match closed out the New York portion, and it was as calamitous as it sounds. Reportedly, when Piper was set to don the gloves, he was ordered to make fists, then have his hands taped. The idea was to take the sting out of Piper's punches, as by taping his balled-up fists, he couldn't extend his fingers, leaving pockets of air at the front of his gloves. The WWF wasn't going to give Piper any chance to actually hurt Mr. T, whom he still detested. Not only was there plenty of space inside Piper's mitts, but the actual punches themselves had a galling amount of air surrounding them. Piper and T's farcical show of pugilism would have only been phonier if someone had been paid to take an obvious dive. Piper did lose, but only via DQ after he struck the referee and then body slammed Mr. T. Former heavyweight champion Smokin' Joe Frazier, who cornered for T, probably winced as much as the savvier parts of the audience did. New York had no satisfying finishes, and worse, the home viewer had to deal with St. James's manic commentary. Here's an actual line. "All right, George, eat his leg." Business picked up a little in Chicago, but not at first. Moolah defeated McIntyre in a wonky 90-second match, while Kirchner vanquished Volkov in barely 2 minutes. The Battle Royal proved a little more entertaining as Pigskin met piledrivers, while NFL greats Dick Butkus and Ed Too Tall Jones patrolled ringside as guest officials. Perry, of course, got the biggest cheers. As a historic footnote, this was the only pay-per-view match for 2 of the WWF's most prolific world champions ever, Bruno Sammartino and Pedro Morales. And if you need to ask who won, Andre was the one standing tall as he cleared out the Hart Foundation in the end. The tag team title match followed, won by the Bulldogs after Dynamite sacrificed himself with a wicked corner headbutt spot that took out Greg Valentine. As Davey Boy Smith tended to his legitimately stunned cousin on the arena floor, Mean Gene interviewed Albano and Ozzy, as though they were the new champions. And why not? Teams don't come much crazier than those two. From there, it was off to the City of Angels for what was probably the strongest portion of the card. Steamboat beat Hercules in a spirited bout, and Adonis defeated Elmer while taking every crazy bump imaginable to make it watchable. The Funks then outlasted JYD and Santana in a truly forgotten WrestleMania classic, which included a table spot long before anyone ever dreamt up ECW. Hogan vs. Bundy closed the whole deal though. Hulk sold his injured ribs while Bundy bladed after getting run into the bars, but the man most worse for wear was Bundy's manager Bobby Heenan. The Brain was hospitalized in Florida due to worsening pain from fractured vertebrae in his neck, an injury he'd incurred in Japan sometime earlier. According to Heenan, someone from the WWF got a hold of him and told him he'd be fired if he missed WrestleMania. And so, Heenan checked out of a Florida hospital that morning, flew to LA, bumped off of a post-match attack from Hogan, and then caught a red-eye flight back home. Hogan, of course, wrote the storybook ending to WrestleMania 2, overcoming his busted ribs to slam the mammoth Bundy before escaping the cage to retain his title. As far as the business of WrestleMania 2 went, that was a bit of a mixed bag. More than 40,000 fans attended, but that spread over 3 normal-sized sports arenas. Long Island sold out at over 16,500 and LA drew 14,500, while Chicago only managed a paltry 9,000. The 250,000 pay-per-view buys were night and day compared to the Wrestling Classic, and closed-circuit viewership fared well enough. However, due to the high costs of putting WrestleMania 2 together, especially all those celebrity payoffs, the WWF still turned a profit, albeit not an exceeding one. And in the days following WrestleMania, McMahon was going to have to learn how to compensate for sizable loss. The first exodus was that of Piper. After getting the last laugh in defeat over Mr. T, the 32-year-old instigator took a leave of absence from professional wrestling, said to be his first real break from the biz in 14 years. This meant no ballsy insults to the faces of Federation good guys, no uniquely riotous post-match brawls, and biggest of all, no Piper's Pit for a time. In the Pit's place, the hammy Adonis hosted a new interview series, The Flower Shop. After a few months away from the ring, Piper returned to the WWF in August, and he did so as a babyface, largely on the merit of crowd response as opposed to some sudden heroic act. Meanwhile, another major exit wasn't as innocuous as a main event player needing to recharge his batteries.
They worked without rights, subject only to the will of the shop owner, who could hire the cheapest possible labor for the longest possible hours.
Sometime before WrestleMania 2, Jesse Ventura had attempted to form a union.
If the boss gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. If the boss gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll the union on.
Inspired by the football star turned NFL Players Association head Gene Upshaw, Ventura rallied the talent at a time when he figured the office would be most vulnerable, when the publicity would have been out for WrestleMania 2, and after McMahon had already invested so much money into the show. If all of the boys refused to work until they were afforded union representation, the body believed Vince would have no choice but to cede to their demands. Somehow, McMahon quickly got word of Ventura's plan and confronted his lead heel announcer. At the same time, Ventura had a chance to co-star in the action film Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was already at odds with Vince over wanting time off for that. So, with McMahon unhappy over this apparent act of subterfuge, Ventura quit the WWF, telling Vince that wrestling would always be there, but opportunities like this were rare. Jesse did WrestleMania 2, then jetted off to Mexico to play the part of the ill-fated Sergeant Blaine. Ventura was an actor now, and thereby got his union by obtaining Screen Actors Guild membership. Not only did he do Predator with Arnold, but Ventura also starred in the Governator's follow-up project, The Running Man. And by the autumn, Ventura found his way back into the WWF, apparently with help from NBC. In Ventura's absence, Heenan commentated alongside McMahon on the May 3rd broadcast of Saturday night's main event. When NBC renewed the series for the fall season, the network wanted Ventura back on the call, so McMahon had to acquiesce by bringing Mr. Hollywood back into the fold. As far as who stooged Ventura's unionization plan to Vince, Jesse wouldn't learn the truth until he sued McMahon over videotape royalties in 1994. With Vince under federal deposition, Ventura had his attorney question the WWF boss about the matter. Under oath, and to Ventura's utter shock, McMahon said that it was Hogan who told him. Ventura later said, for him to pretend to be friends with all of us, to ultimately stop us from unionizing, which would have made life better in countless ways for all of us, is pretty sad. From that point on, I lost all respect for him. The bungee cord tenures of major stars like Piper and Ventura came amid further changes to the WWF faculty. Head booker George Scott lost his position in June, reportedly due to fallouts with both Hogan and Piper. Studd ended up leaving by mid-autumn, and the nomadic Terry Funk departed right after WrestleMania 2, frazzled by the hellish travel schedule. To fill his spot, the WWF brought in a new Funk relative, kid brother Jimmy Jack Funk, played by Portland-born Jesse Barr. Wearing a Lone Ranger mask and acting all manner of crazy, Jimmy Jack lacked the authentic grit of his kayfabe brethren. At least Terry Funk was replaced by a human being, though. Tag team guru Captain Lou Albano was let go that autumn for disputed reasons, and filling his spot in the corner for the British Bulldogs was Matilda, a literal bulldog. As had been the case for the previous few years, territorial stars began settling into the WWF en masse, seeing how long they could last in the big time. Such figures included the rambunctious Dick Slater, multi-time Pacific Northwest champion Billy Jack Haynes, boisterous Continental mainstay Coco Beware, complete with his macaw Frankie, and tough-as-nails Mid-South brawler Butch Reed. Packaged with Reed was an old Kansas City running buddy, the talkative and ebullient doctor of style, Slick. And speaking of Kansas City, a very curious acquisition was made in the spring of '86. 8-time NWA World Champion Harley Race turned up in the WWF that May. His arrival came roughly 6 weeks after he was said to have tensely confronted Hogan backstage at a WWF card in Kansas City, taking exception to the Federation running he and Bob Geigel's region. At the time, however, Race was beginning to pull his interests out of KC due to a major downturn in business. Geigel would in fact sell the territory to Jim Crockett Jr. later that year. But now, Race was with the WWF and took on Heenan as his manager. To acknowledge his accolade-heavy career at a time when happenings in other companies were ignored, the WWF had Race win the 1986 King of the Ring, giving him the royal splendor in lieu of mentioning his prior world championships. The King issue led to a very strange lawsuit filed by Jerry Lawler over trademark infringement in the state of Tennessee, since, Lawler's the king and all of that. As a result, Race had to use a modified version of his gimmick for WWF events in Tennessee, and couldn't be outright referred to as the King of Wrestling. Bill Eadie, once the masked superstar, came back into the WWF fold too, now wearing a mask of a different sort. In June, the WWF purchased the rights to a gimmick from New Japan that Eadie and a tag team partner had previously portrayed, one that was predicated on all-concealing masks. The Machines, as they were known, were a mysterious babyface duo from Japan that looked to be indomitable. Eadie played Super Machine, while the role of Giant Machine went to the only man in the world that possessed that specific body type. Due to Andre the Giant's decline in health, particularly his back, and with him taking time off to work on The Princess Bride, playing the immortal Fezzik, a storyline was concocted to give Andre a quiet out. In the story, the 500-pounder missed some events, to which opportunistic enemy Heenan called for his suspension, and President Jack Tunney indeed dinged Andre for the no-shows. But then, this mysterious Machines tandem suddenly appeared, and an irate Heenan insisted that Giant Machine was clearly Andre. Tunney declared that if Heenan could prove it was Andre beneath the shroud, then he would permanently suspend the Giant. Neither Heenan, nor Studd, nor Bundy, nor whoever could unmask Giant Machine, much to the crowd's amusement. And when Andre stepped aside, other machines filled in to irk the brain on his behalf, including regular stand-in Big Machine, Blackjack Mulligan, and some familiar-looking friends like Hulk Machine, Piper Machine, Animal Machine, George, not the Road Warrior, and even special guest Crusher Machine in Minnesota. And speaking of machines, the promotional machine spit out a rather dubious babyface late that summer in former Memphis and Stampede star The Honky Tonk Man, a cheerful Elvis impersonator. And the fans couldn't help but be cruel to Honky, who routinely found himself booed by WWF crowds despite endorsements from other faces like Hogan. Eventually, an angle was devised to turn Honky heel, in which the oblivious crooner asked for a vote of confidence from the home audience. Out of a reported 670,000 votes, barely 10% backed Honky. And honestly, this was a good thing, seeing as heel Honky, managed by Colonel Jimmy Hart, would make for one of the preeminent bad guys of his time. Also coming in from Stampede was Mega Man Tom McGee, a Canadian powerlifter with Greek god features and astounding agility. Despite these positives, however, McGee was greener than Easter grass and needed to be in the ring with a strong opponent in order to look good. Bret Hart drew that task in a famed non-television bout that October, where he made McGee look like a future champion. However, McGee struggled to replicate that performance in future dark matches, mostly because he didn't have Bret to walk him through the steps, and Mega Man rarely, if ever, breached the perimeter of WWF television. Another body guy was struggling, but this one had prior success to his name: Superstar Billy Graham. The former WWF champion of a decade earlier was shown in vignettes to be training for a return to the WWF ring, but after one televised squash match, went off to have hip replacement surgery. The return of the man who inspired the wide-eyed, fast-talking muscle men of wrestling's future was gonna have to wait. Meanwhile, Hulk Hogan, the reigning king of the muscle men, was embroiled in the grudge of the year. As America commemorated the centennial of the Statue of Liberty's dedication, the WWF's most ardent patriot began dealing with a domestic nuisance. Former enemy Orndorff had become a disciple to the almighty Hulk, but before long, cracks began forming in his friendlier facade. A few minorly humbling moments, such as Adonis and others referring to Orndorff as Hulk Jr., ate away at the ego of Mr. Wonderful. Orndorff then began acting out during tag matches, to Hogan's chagrin. But the real eruption occurred on the July 19th broadcast of Championship Wrestling, following a DQ win over Bundy and Studd. Orndorff saved a battered Hogan in the post-match before suddenly leveling him with a clothesline and then spiking him with his trademark piledriver. Orndorff had sold out to the Heenan family, letting his pent-up jealousy toward Hulk guide him astray. Sometimes dubbed Benedict Orndorff in deference to this treachery, Mr. Wonderful began making his entrance to Real American in a rather quaint troll job. For the remainder of 1986, Hogan and Orndorff waged war at dozens of live events, drawing ungodly money and sold-out houses for their hate-filled feud. The two even headlined in front of 64,000 strong at Toronto's CNE Stadium for a $1 million Canadian gate on August 28th, at a supercard plainly named The Big Event. Hogan won the 11-minute title bout via DQ, a typical non-finish in their lucrative saga. The other notable contest from the big event saw Ricky Steamboat go over on Jake Roberts in what was dubbed a snake pit match. The two men had feuded since the springtime, and their rivalry included a rather unnerving moment. During a pre-match attack on the Saturday night's main event, Roberts DDT'd Steamboat on the concrete floor, legitimately knocking the Dragon unconscious. Steamboat had apparently assured Jake beforehand that he could pull up his head just before the impact. And, not quite. In what may be the most impressive feat of strength in Roberts' career, he managed to deadlift the slumping 225-pound Steamboat up to the apron following the knockout. The compelling television continued in times where TV itself was changing. The syndicated shows rebranded in September as Championship Wrestling became Superstars of Wrestling, primarily hosted by McMahon and Ventura, with Bruno adding analysis, while All-Star Wrestling turned into Wrestling Challenge, hosted by Monsoon and Heenan. The two programs comprised the essential WWF syndication block for the next decade, while complementing cable programs All-American Wrestling on Sundays and Primetime Wrestling on Mondays. Shortly thereafter, the WWF said goodbye to Tuesday Night Titans, and the show went out with quite a bang, as the final episode was basically an hour-long dirty joke, with Mean Gene, Roberts, Blassie, and others making every barely veiled double entendre they could think of. Ironically, the Iron Sheik was one of the cleaner talking heads on the program. Oh, and a bear showed up, complete with a lower third that simply said, "Bear." Diligent production, if nothing else. In more serious television matters, there was a heated war of talk shows as now brave-hearted Piper sought to reinstall Piper's Pit, though Adonis refused to budge his several-month-old flower shop. On one Superstars episode, Piper ended up getting his knee brutalized by Adonis, as well as now former friends Orton and Morocco. On the following week's show, a positively mad Piper destroyed the flower shop set with a baseball bat, yelling that it would take more than that to keep him down. Savage pressed on as Intercontinental Champion, scraping past the likes of Santana and Steele before a new looming threat to his title emerged in the form of Steamboat. The Dragon had all the tools necessary to defeat the highly skilled Macho Man, and Savage knew it. That's why the champ attempted to crush Steamboat's throat during a match on Superstars, first by delivering his flying axe handle to the Dragon while his neck was sprawled on the guardrail, then by landing a follow-up top rope attack on Steamboat's throat, this time with the ring bell. Around that same time, Savage ran into a curious challenger on one Saturday night's main event, fellow heel Roberts. The Los Angeles crowd was notably hipper to Jake, something remarked upon by commentators McMahon and Ventura during this one-off bout. In fact, a TV angle in which Roberts attacked Hogan never aired due to the crowd cheering quite loudly for Jake the Snake. A face turn was all but inevitable. As for Hogan, he finally put the Orndorff feud to rest on the first Saturday night's main event of 1987, defeating Mr. Wonderful in a heated steel cage match. The showdown was notable for a contested finish in which both champion and challenger escaped the cage, reaching the arena floor at seemingly the same time. Oddly acting referee Danny Davis was insistent that Orndorff won, but the match was forced to continue and Hulk ultimately prevailed. Davis would later be the referee of record for an actual title change, one surrounded by a handful of noteworthy events. On January 25th, 1987, Vince McMahon held a massive Super Bowl party for the entire WWF crew in Tampa. For the first time since the Super Bowl's inception, the Giants were the ones hoisting the Lombardi Trophy. In a sense, this paralleled the state of professional wrestling, as all possible opposition was conquered by the squad from New York. Well, technically New Jersey, but go with me here. The following day, the mood was a little more somber at the Superstars taping in Tampa's Sundome. There, the British Bulldogs dropped the WWF World Tag Team titles to their longtime counterparts, the Hart Foundation. But rather than a spirited battle between two teams that could deliver at a high level, the bout was virtually a handicap match, as Dynamite Kid was jumped before the bell, leaving Davey Boy Smith to fight valiantly against the odds. Corrupted referee Davis plainly ignored several of Smith's winning predicaments, but was quick to count him down once the heels hit their heart attack finish. The match lasted just 3 minutes, but by all accounts, that was 3 more minutes than Dynamite could have comfortably worked. The previous month in Hamilton, Ontario, the real-life Tom Billington suffered a dire back injury during a match against Orton and Morocco. The 28-year-old wrestling machine had worked through serious accumulated pains to that point, and his body finally gave out. His career was in serious jeopardy. But injured or not, Dynamite insisted on dropping the titles inside the ring, saying that he would only lose to the Harts after McMahon had first suggested Sheik and Volkov. Smith had to basically help his cousin to the ring just so that he could be lightly struck by Jimmy Hart's megaphone and rendered helpless on the floor. Reflecting on it years later, Bret Hart wrote, "I looked down at my belt realizing what being champion had cost Tom. I wondered what it would cost me." In a sense, the Harts were lucky they even ended up with the gold. 11 days earlier, Jim Neidhart was arrested on charges of striking a flight attendant. However, McMahon believed the Anvil when he said he did nothing wrong, and felt it was a case of a wrestler being unfairly targeted. Not only was Neidhart acquitted, but McMahon bankrolled a lawsuit on Neidhart's behalf against US Air for malicious prosecution, to which Neidhart was awarded a $380,000 judgment. As a footnote, Neidhart was represented in both cases by attorney Jerry McDevitt. It marked the first time, though certainly not the last time, that McDevitt represented the McMahon side in a court of law. But before earning that 6-figure judgment, Neidhart's biggest reward was a tag team title reign with his wife's brother. Big a win as it was for the Harts, the more newsworthy event from that hour of television occurred later on Piper's Pit. More than a month prior, it was announced that Andre had been reinstated from his kayfabe suspension. A curious detail of the reinstatement was that Andre did not attend the reinstatement hearing with Jack Tunney, but Heenan did. It would seem that Bobby the Brain looked quite foolish losing at a hearing that his adversary wasn't even at. But there was more than what met the eye. At 2 ensuing Piper's Pits, the WWF recognized 2 of their most prolific stars. First, Hogan was given a trophy in acknowledgement of his 3 uninterrupted years as WWF champion. A week later, Andre was given his own trophy for going 15 years undefeated as far as Federation canon went. Hogan spoke at length during Andre's ceremony, prompting a slightly irritated Andre to walk off the set. Andre's trophy being obviously smaller than Hogan's was another little bone of contention. With obvious friction between Hogan and Andre, Ventura appeared on the next Piper's Pit, indicating that he had a journalistic scoop. He asked the Hot Rod to produce Hogan the following week, and Ventura would bring Andre to get to the heart of the matter. Less than 20 minutes after the Hart's title win aired, the most famous Piper's Pit of all time transpired. Hogan, Piper, and Ventura stood anxious on the Kilt Prince stage, awaiting the arrival of the 8th wonder of the world, and when he turned up, he wasn't alone. Andre entered the summit flanked by Heenan, much to Hogan and Piper's confusion. Hulk demanded answers, but Andre offered only a sober glance. Heenan did the talking, accusing Hogan of ducking Andre for 3 years, never once offering him a title match, and using their friendship to keep Andre docile and disinterested. Hogan tried reasoning with Andre, but the Giant was having none of it. He quickly got to the point, challenging Hogan to a world title match at WrestleMania 3. As Hogan tried coming to grips with this head-spinning development, Andre ripped off Hogan's shirt and crucifix necklace, while inadvertently cutting Hulk's torso with the crucifix. The unintended wound added to the gravity of the moment, as after Andre, Heenan, and Ventura departed, a sullen Hulk crouched to pick up his personal effects, while a concerned Piper uttered with zero emotion, "You're bleeding." As the story went, Andre wasn't needed for the reinstatement hearing. Heenan argued his case for him because he wanted him as a client. Needing the ultimate weapon to dethrone Hogan and finally bring the WWF title to the Heenan family, the Brain, brainwashed Andre. The once gentle Giant was now hell-bent on destroying the WWF's infallible superhero. While a logical main event on paper, it was hardly a slam dunk. 40-year-old Andre's back was in horrendous shape, and he was in desperate need of surgery. And though common law has it that Andre had the surgery prior to WrestleMania 3, he in fact didn't go under the knife until July of 1987, 4 months after the card. Nonetheless, McMahon was able to convince Andre, going so far as to fly across the Atlantic to visit him during the filming of Princess Bride, to co-headline the biggest wrestling event yet. And big is an understatement. The 64,000 drawn to August 1986's big event removed any doubt that the WWF could pull similar numbers for future stadium shows. Ever competitive, McMahon had designs on passing that total. WrestleMania 3 would emanate from the Silverdome in Pontiac, Michigan, about 30 miles northwest of Detroit. The home of the NFL's Lions could seat more than 80,000 spectators, but with the smaller playing surface for wrestling, there'd be room for thousands more fans at field level. McMahon needed something match of the century caliber to fill the Silverdome, and he had the biggest possible matchup in Hulk vs. Andre. Granted, they'd faced off many times in the late 70s and early 80s in various promotions, including the WWF at Shea Stadium in 1980, but the rock and wrestling audience knew little of what went on pre-Hogan's title reign. Andre was on board for the match, but his physical condition was a legitimate concern. It's been said that the reason Paul Orndorff was left off the WrestleMania 3 card was so he could be an understudy as a possible last-minute fill-in if Andre just couldn't go. The Giant had only worked one match since September, a Battle Royal on the Saturday night's main event that aired 2 weeks prior to WrestleMania. Hogan also took part in the free-for-all, and the lure of a confrontation between feuding titans gave the program its highest rating ever, an 11.6. The crowd was also highly impressive, as 21,000 fans filled Detroit's Joe Louis Arena for this WrestleMania preview. Andre's newfound mean streak was on full display when he pummeled Lanny Poffo bloody before chucking him to the floor. All the early eliminations were facilitated by Hulk and Andre, but after Hogan sent Orndorff to the floor, Andre swooped in and stunned the champion with some brain-rattling headbutts before sending him over the ropes. Sure, Andre went out moments later, but it took 8 men to throw him over. Felling Hogan required only 1 Giant. Equaling the magnitude of Hulk Andre was nigh impossible, but an impressive undercard was nonetheless assembled. One of the matches was historic in its own right, because it marked the apparent farewell of an icon. Roddy Piper wanted to leave the fans wanting more, to go out on top. A month prior to WrestleMania, he announced the Pontiac Supercard was going to be his wrestling swan song. His last bit of business before headed out the door was to defeat Adonis in a hair versus hair match. But win, lose, or draw, Piper's uncontainable growl would at last be muted. Steamboat found his voice again after Savage's brutal attack and understandably swore revenge. The Silverdome was just the place for their inevitable clash for the Intercontinental title, and George Steele would be in there to make sure Savage didn't do anything outside the rules. In six-man tag action, the Hartswood team with the disgraced referee Davis, fired from his post but now a wrestler in Jimmy Hart's camp, to take on the Bulldogs and Santana, whose IC title loss to Savage a year earlier was retroactively pinned on Davis's shoddy officiating. According to Brett, the six-man was made to take the pressure off Dynamite, who was going to try and press on inside the ring. Injuries be damned. Aside from the Hearts and Bulldogs, the WWF had a staggering wealth of tag teams at their disposal, reflected in 3 bouts on the card. The Dream Team versus the Rougeaus, the Killer Bees versus Sheik and Volkov, and Morocco and Orton versus the Can-Am Connection, Rick Martel and Tom Zenk. This is to say nothing of teams that didn't even make the card, including Haku and Tama of the Islanders, Paul Roma and Jim Powers of the Young Stallions, and Road Warrior Analog's Demolition, consisting of Axe, the former Masked Superstar, and Smash, former Crockett villain Crusher Khrushchev. Other face-offs included a loser must bow match between Race and Junkyard Dog, and a battle between Roberts and Honky, facilitated by a guitar shot to the head that apparently caused Jake some long-term health issues. Hercules would face Billy Jack Haynes in a battle of true powerhouses, while recent acquisitions Coco Beware and Butch Reed were set for singles action. The most double-take-inducing attraction, due to the sheer size contrast, was a 6-man mixed tag, in which Hillbilly Jim and King Kong Bundy would each team with 2 mini-wrestlers, Haiti Kid and Little Beaver on Jim's team, and Lord Littlebrook and Little Tokyo on Bundy's. The celebrity element was less crowded than the previous year, but the stars were nonetheless out. Detroit-born shock rocker Alice Cooper would accompany Roberts for his match, while songstress Aretha Franklin was booked to sing America the Beautiful. Bob Uecker, the beloved Mr. Baseball, had ring announcing duties for the world title match, while Entertainment Tonight hostess Mary Hart would act as timekeeper. Both Uecker and Hart also did commentary for select matches and conducted some backstage interviews. But everyone knows the real star of the show was the motorized rope and post-adorned cart that transported the wrestlers to and from the ring. The world would be such a better place if they ever brought it back. McMahon was counting on this card to fill the Silverdome. To try and accomplish his goal, WrestleMania 3 pay-per-view was blacked out in the state of Michigan as a way to try to force locals to attend. And as one might expect, there were reportedly major traffic jams on March 29, 1987, cars near hopelessly gridlocking into Pontiac on the day of the show, which even affected the guest pool. Aretha Franklin arrived late due to traffic and didn't even have time for a sound check. Her performance did go off without a hitch, and few would have guessed Franklin's late arrival. McMahon was the one who introduced the Queen of Soul after addressing the mammoth crowd to begin the show. Years later, McMahon claimed that he felt the spirit of his father just as he bellowed the words "Welcome to WrestleMania 3." 3 years after Vince Sr.'s passing, and here Vincent K. stood, before a crowd that'd make one go, "What territory system?" As far as that Silverdome crowd goes, the actual attendance has been subject to rampant, decades-old dispute. The given number was 93,173, though Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter has claimed that according to longtime WWF event promoter Zane Breslov, the actual attendance was closer to 78,000. Whatever the case, it was an enormous audience, one that still gives pause when viewed decades later. From there, it was off to the races. The Can-Ams won a short but spirited opener, Hercules and Haynes fought to a double countout with Billy Jack losing a bit of blood during the finish, and Hillbilly's team won the unusual 6-man by DQ after Bundy broke protocol and demolished poor Little Beaver. Race eked past Junkyard Dog, who had attacked the King with a chair seconds after his post-match bow. The Dream Team defeated the Rougeaus following interference from new third team member Dino Bravo. Then, for some reason, the rest of the winning team abandoned Brutus Beefcake, leading to a mildly random face turn for Brutus. In the afternoon's 6th match, a determined Piper ended up squeaking past Adonis after an assist from Beefcake, whose hair Adonis had accidentally cut in an angle weeks earlier, which honestly sounds difficult. Piper put Adonis out with his sleeper hold, then shaved off the Adorable One's locks post-match with Beefcake's help. This marked a new beginning for Beefcake as he soon became the Barber and a victorious last hurrah for the retirement-bound Piper. For Adonis, it was a last hurrah of a different sort. He left the WWF about a month later, though managed to work himself back into better shape while wrestling for AWA and New Japan over the year ahead. Tragically, however, Adonis and 2 other wrestlers died in a vehicular accident in eastern Canada on July 4th, 1988. The gifted former tag team champion was only 34 years old. Back to WrestleMania, and the other 6-man tag was up next, and to the joy of the crowd, Davis took a hearty beating, including eating a leaping tombstone from Davey Boy. But by the skin of his teeth, Dangerous Danny did manage to score the pin after bashing Smith with Jimmy Hart's megaphone. Reed then defeated Coco in a very short match, setting the stage for one of the WWF's all-time classics. Savage and Steamboat had a big fight feel to it, preceded by each man delivering arguably their most iconic promos ever. History seemed to beckon the Macho Man, while the Dragon vowed to see new horizons with a vengeful victory. What followed was the template for 1,000,001 main events to come, with a slew of false finishes, well-executed dramatic beats, and some well-crafted storyline callbacks. Savage seemingly had the match won following a ref bump, but was compelled to use the heavy ring bell once more. Steele intervened, and Savage paid dearly for his attempt to cheat. When an unsteady Macho tried to regain control with a scoop slam, Steamboat deftly cradled him to claim the IC title, culminating his revenge mission. To many, it's the WWF's greatest match of the 1980s, and still rates among the finest WrestleMania outings ever. Under the hysteria of the tens of thousands on hand, both parties exited the ringside on those carts in very different spirits. Steamboat exhausted and triumphant beside an exultant Animal, while Liz consoled a dejected Savage on their ride back to the curtain. Jake and Honky performed admirably in trying to follow that spectacle. The Elvis impersonator cheated to victory, while poor Jimmy Hart was tormented by a Damien-wielding Cooper after the match. From there, Volkov and Sheik scored a DQ win over the Bees after newcomer and proud American hacksaw Jim Duggan belted Sheik with his trusty 2x4. 11 matches up, 11 matches down. Rounding out the Dirty Dozen was the veritable match of the century. Andre entered first on the cart, accompanied by Heenan, wearing a magnificent white tuxedo for the grand occasion. The jam-packed crowd booed lustily and threw projectile trash as Bob Uecker formally introduced the challenger. Once a hero, Andre now stood as an affront to the tenets of Hulkamania. Perhaps the crowd would have been impressed if they knew that Andre allegedly drank 14 bottles of wine the day of the match. The college kids might even have hailed him as their god. Hogan entered second, shunning the cart in favor of a virtuous march into battle, just as Piper did earlier in the night. The stare down and the flashbulbs followed. Generally a biased observer, Ventura marveled as much as Monsoon and the capacity crowd, as the historic images flickered before the eyes of the world. Understanding Andre's extreme physical limits, Hogan did all the pinballing that he could off his opponent's strikes and slams, even letting Andre land on top of him after his own failed slam attempt. When in control, Andre relied on a stationary bear hug, which the crowd bought as their cue to rally behind Hulk to break free. The champ did find his opening when Andre missed a headbutt outside the ring. The crowd could feel the tide slowly turning as Hogan made his move back between the ropes, avoiding a big boot before dropping Andre with a charging clothesline. The frenzy grew incrementally fiercer as Hogan dipped into that famed reserve, summoning the strength for one of wrestling's most famous visuals, a mighty body slam in which Hulk slowly but surely overturned Andre before throwing him to the canvas. Santana later recalled a crowd gathered by the monitors in the back sharing a collective wow when the slam occurred, partially in amazement due to Andre, in his state of deterioration, even taking the move. Beneath the ungodly din, Hogan landed the academic leg drop and retained his title. But Hogan had worried about Andre not cooperating with him during the match. Andre apparently acted uneasy and moody towards Hulk in the days and weeks before the match, but that was all apparent posturing, attributed to Andre's sense of humor. Andre did what he could, Hogan did the rest, and the torch was passed from one era to the next. Like the IC title match, the exits were as iconic as the matches. Heenan hung his head in frustration aboard the ring cart as Andre yelled fighting words back toward Hulk in the ring. And Hogan's exodus saw the ring cart rise like a scissor lift, carrying him away with a pronounced ascent, allegorical to Hogan's rise into pro wrestling's pantheon of immortals. And when all was said and done, the only thing standing taller than Hogan were the stacks of cash. WrestleMania 3 generated $1.6 million at the gate, while accounting for a then record $10.3 million on pay-per-view, to the tune of 400,000 buys, which is quite impressive for 1987. Dave Meltzer may call out the reported Silverdome attendance as being inflated, but when he calls Hogan-Andre the most important match in modern wrestling history, exaggeration is absent. Andre received a reported $1 million for the match, $750,000 as co-headliner, and an extra $250,000 for doing the honors. But Hogan had something better than cash: the earned title of Giant Slayer. With Andre vanquished, it seemed nobody was going to dethrone the WWF champion. And with territories dying and the WWF thriving, it seemed too that the McMahon monarchy would reign forever. WrestleMania 3 only affirmed the stark reality. The World Wrestling Federation was the biggest fish, and a still growing one, in an increasingly emptying pond. Meanwhile, some of the former big fish were becoming fish food. In the spring of 1987, news broke that Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling, since rebranded as the Universal Wrestling Federation, was selling off to Crockett. One reason for the sale was the oil-based recession that struck the state of Oklahoma in late 1986, leaving UWF fans with less disposable income. That, and the fact that the UWF, exciting as the product may have been, was at best a distant third behind McMahon and Jim Crockett Jr., and just couldn't compete with their prime revenue streams. The territories in general were drying up. Crockett had also recently absorbed Championship Wrestling from Florida, 2 years after owner Eddie Graham committed suicide. Ole Anderson's Reborn Georgia territory had already been soaked up by Crockett, as had Sam Muchnick's St. Louis Wrestling Club. McMahon had the LaBelle's LA group under his belt and had bought his way into the Tunney family's Toronto. The Houston territory, long owned by Paul Bosch, started partnering with McMahon until Bosch retired in August of 1987, at which point the WWF assumed the region for themselves. If you wanted to watch wrestling not controlled by McMahon or Crockett in 1987, your pickings were getting slimmer. Dick the Bruiser's Indianapolis group was on its last legs, Stu Hart still operated his reanimated Stampede in Calgary, but with a shell of its old roster. Bob Geigel retained control of Kansas City in 1987, long after the glory days had faded, and Al Tomko's All-Star Wrestling in Vancouver wasn't long for this world, though did in its final years introduce their audience to teenage prodigy Mauro Ranallo. Some groups were a little better off, though in a few cases, not by much. The Von Erich's Dallas group and Jerry Jarrett's Continental Territory in Memphis still had a pulse. Ditto Don Owen's Portland Territory, and Vern Gagne's AWA was still superpower-ish enough, even if the banner years with Hogan, Heenan, and more had long passed. There was also a unique novelty promotion called Glow, Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. Founded by promoter David McLean, Glow was more TV series than conventional promotion, with Mando Guerrero teaching many actresses the basics of wrestling. More tongue-in-cheek than the usual fare, most of the Glow performers acted out simple caricatures that anyone could understand, like Sally the Farmer's Daughter, Mount Fiji, Scarlett the Southern Belle, and the glamorous Tina Ferrari, played by future WWE star Ivory. So while some could still enjoy their local wrestling flavors, the menu was getting smaller. Crockett had assembled a sizable juggernaut, though McMahon's WWF still assumed the biggest stage. They had become to wrestling what Michael Jackson was to pop music, the hitmaker, the record breaker, and the trendsetter. And in a year where Jackson released Bad, featuring the track Smooth Criminal, it was appropriate that two post-Mania incidences would relate to crime. One was the return of a man recently released from prison, Ken Patera. The former Intercontinental Champion was convicted in June 1985, along with former WWF Tag Team Champion Masa Saito, of battery of a police officer, after the two men were alleged to have assaulted several cops in a bizarre April 1984 altercation in Wisconsin. When the incident occurred, both men were wrestling for the AWA, though at the time of Patera's conviction, the strongman was within the WWF, a heel under the tutelage of Bobby Heenan. Patera served 18 months of his 2-year sentence, and in early 1987, he returned to the WWF. He was reintroduced in a very curious manner, as a babyface seeking revenge on Heenan. Through a series of vignettes that depicted Patera gaining his freedom, Patera accused one-time manager Heenan of not looking after his family while he was incarcerated. Most often, Patera, while acknowledging his own poor decisions, charged that Heenan sold him down the river during a major low point in his life. Heenan, for his part, seemed to be in the right when he repeatedly claimed not to be responsible for what Patera did outside the ring, but the brain was bound to play the heel, in particular during an in-ring debate of sorts on the May 2nd edition of WWF Superstars. As Heenan and Patera exchanged caustic words, Heenan removed his belt and began whipping Patera with it. Bad idea, as the granite-strong Patera fought back, wrapping the belt around Heenan's legitimately injured neck. Patera then, in a rather brutal visual, threw Heenan across the ring before violently jerking back on the belt, whiplashing Heenan like a tiny dog on a leash. The Brain wore a neck brace for months after the attack, while vowing his own revenge. Family members like Hercules, Paul Orndorff, Harley Race, and King Kong Bundy were dispatched to try and eradicate Patera in what turned out to be a pretty heated angle. Unfortunately, Patera ended up sidelined with a ruptured biceps tendon sometime into the saga, and by the time he came back, any heat had died off. A different wrestler arrest took place the final week of May 1987, and it would have been a little more difficult to turn into an angle, mainly because the two men involved were sworn enemies on camera at the time. On Tuesday, May 26th, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Iron Sheik were driving on the New Jersey Turnpike en route to a house show where they'd be on opposite sides of a tag team match. Ironically, Duggan's partner that night was Patera. The two were both drinking beer, and Duggan did admit to having a bag of marijuana stowed under the driver's seat. During the trip, Duggan drove right past a New Jersey state trooper, apparently with his drink visible. The trooper then pulled the two over, and before you know it, things went from bad to worse. Duggan admitted to having marijuana in the car, and a subsequent search revealed that Sheik had a vial of cocaine among his effects. Both men were then arrested. The next day, things went from worse to even worse. The arrest was now all over the news, not only because of the relative notoriety of Sheik and Duggan, but because it was two on-screen enemies that were caught having a little party on four wheels. It's actually harder to say what the bigger injustice was in the eyes of the company, the arrests or the flagrant breach of kayfabe. Whatever the case, McMahon fired both Hacksaw and his canonical enemy. At the Superstars tapings in Buffalo a week later, McMahon held a company-wide meeting where he both preached the necessity of kayfabe and declared that the WWF would begin testing for cocaine. So, if any of the promos from this time feel a little more subdued than usual, this may be why. The war on drugs was in full swing in the United States. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 mandated minimum prison sentences of at least 5 years for possession of 500 grams of powdered cocaine and 5 grams of crack cocaine. Though Duggan, by all accounts, had nothing to do with the coke, his name made those unsavory headlines in conjunction with the illicit substance. The 33-year-old heavyweight was due for a major push in the WWF, and now it was gone. Duggan, however, did manage to get rehired at the end of August, after pushing his way through a leg injury while working Paul Bosch's retirement show. McMahon was present at the card and seemed impressed by Duggan's resolve, so Hacksaw got a new lease on life. At the time, however, it did look like Duggan had squandered a golden ticket. Another wrestler who missed out on a major opportunity around that time was the natural Butch Reed, and a different beneficiary reaped the rewards at that very TV taping in Buffalo. When Ricky the Dragon Steamboat defeated Macho Man Randy Savage in their epic encounter at WrestleMania 3 to become Intercontinental Champion, many assumed the babyface star was going to be a long-term title holder. And by all accounts, that was the plan. Less than 2 months into Steamboat's time with the belt, however, he apparently went to Vince and requested a little time off for the impending birth of his son, a future WWE prospect under the name of Richie Steamboat. McMahon was displeased by this request, so much so that he decided to punish Steamboat by having his number 2 babyface drop the championship post-haste. For what it's worth, Steamboat has since implied that there was apparent friction within the office over he and Savage upstaging Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant at WrestleMania, which seems silly being that Andre was largely immobile anyway. But McMahon had it in his mind that Steamboat was going to drop the title barely 2 months into his reign. Originally, flamboyant powerhouse Reed was tabbed to slay the dragon, but in the run-up to the switch, a weary Reed had missed some house shows, and after that, company brass decided to go with a different heel champion. Up to and including Steamboat, only 8 men had held the WWF Intercontinental title, and all of them were either viable future main eventers or credibly main event adjacent. At any time over the previous 2 or 3 years, Steamboat, Savage, Valentine, Santana, and Morocco would have looked right at home challenging Hogan or Sheik for the WWF title. Each of these men had grit, a certain gravitas that made them believable champions. That's why it was quite curious to many when the WWF decided to go with the Honky Tonk Man, at the time a novelty mid-carder who impersonated Elvis Presley while claiming to have never heard of him. Unpopular as a short-lived babyface and detestable as a pesky villain, Honky could play an admirable punching bag for the good guys to wail on, but an Intercontinental Champion? In actuality, it was that peskiness and it was that beat-upableness that made the belt fit so perfectly around Honky's jumpsuited waist. Sure, it was stunning to see him score a wonky pinfall on Steamboat after a few elapsed minutes of a weekend TV match, but that only made the sudden upset more effective. This Brill-creamed halfwit is the WWF Intercontinental Champion? That is a question that Federation fans would have many months to ask aloud. By the time the reign finally ended, Honky's heelish boast of being the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time was backed up by strong numbers. As for who would ultimately get to send Honky to the Heartbreak Hotel, there were plenty of viable choices. While Piper, Duggan, Sheik, and an ailing Andre were all away due to different circumstances, the locker room continued to replenish itself. Bullwhip-toting hombre Ron Bass, nicknamed Outlaw, turned up earlier in 1987, looking to feud with incumbent marauder Blackjack Mulligan. However, Blackjack left the WWF before any angle could begin. So Bass instead settled into a featured role in the mid-card. Imported from Australia was good-natured bushman Outback Jack. The US had grown enamored with all things Aussie in the latter half of the 80s, particularly Crocodile Dundee and his laid-back machismo, and Outback was an attempt to capitalize on the culture craze. Unfortunately, despite an interminable amount of character vignettes, Jack couldn't back up the blitz inside the ring, and the novelty wore off before long. One tag team flamed out even quicker than Outback, though it certainly wasn't for a lack of talent. The Midnight Rockers of Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty dropped the AWA World Tag Team titles before debuting at the Buffalo tapings, but was shown the door a day later. The pair apparently got a little too rowdy, smashing some dinnerware at an after-party, and lost their new jobs as a result. At least the Rockers would be back. The same couldn't be said for Missy Hyatt, the blonde bombshell that complemented eventual husband Eddie Gilbert's Hot Stuff International stable in the UWF. Between UWF stints, Hyatt briefly worked for the WWF, hosting an ostensible Piper's Pit replacement called Missy's Manor. Despite filming more than half a dozen segments, the WWF aired none of them, and Hyatt departed shortly thereafter. Other females fared a little bit better. Sensational Sherry Martel made her debut by capturing the WWF Women's title from the fabulous Moolah that July. Itsuki Yamazaki and Norio Tatano, the Jumping Bomb Angels, debuted around the same time, bringing a grace rarely seen in the American women's scene of the era. They had a pair of foils in the Glamour Girls, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai, who won the WWF Women's Tag Team titles in 1985 in an apocryphal title change, and then apparently went into witness protection for 2 years. Plucked from the carcass of the UWF was its recent champion, the One-Man Gang. The 6'9", 450-pound hooligan from Chicago's mean streets paired well with new manager Slick, and added another looming frame to a promotion enamored with its behemoths. At least Gang dropped his belt before jumping ship. The same couldn't be said for ravishing Rick Rude, chiseled Lothario, and legitimate arm wrestling champion. Rude never lost his half of the Mid-Atlantic version of the World Tag Team titles before signing with the WWF, where he became another prized asset of the talent-rich Heenan family. Meanwhile, all managers on deck coveted one Bam Bam Bigelow. The tattooed ruffian contrasted his meaty brawling style with astounding agility, capable of flipping, slingshotting, and cartwheeling in the manner of an Olympic gymnast. Every villainous agent in the WWF attempted to sign Bam Bam, only for the beast from the East to spurn them all in favor of an odd selection: the gaudily dressed Sir Oliver Humperdinck, a recent arrival to the Federation himself. Sam Houston, the 23-year-old half-brother of Jake Roberts, arrived in the WWF that May. Another Texas-based wrestler, the sinewy, face-painted Dingo Warrior, turned up in June, and eventually dropped the Dingo in favor of Ultimate. A wise choice. Another acquisition from the Lone Star State was of a non-wrestler, albeit a pretty important figure, all things considered. Bruce Pritchard had worked in TV production for Paul Bosch's Houston group since his preteen years, learning the ins and outs of life behind the curtain. Now 24, Pritchard joined up with the WWF as a jack-of-all-trades figure backstage, as well as an occasional announcer. A year later, Pritchard introduced the world to Brother Love, a blatantly smarmy send-up of corrupt 80s televangelists like Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, and Robert Tilton. But before Brother Love could rhapsodize amorously in his labored drawl, another greedy character would hit the WWF scene, and quickly become its #1 heel. When one discusses performers with lots of range, Ted DiBiase merits inclusion. In the 1980s, the second-generation DiBiase capably played, depending on the year and territory, the rough-and-tumble brawler, the humble technician, the gutsy and gallant scrapper, and the calculating Blackheart. With form-perfect technical skills and the body language of a seasoned stage actor, DiBiase had few peers inside the ring. In the spring of 1987, after Crockett acquired the very UWF in which DiBiase plied his trade, the promoter attempted to sign DiBiase himself. That's when the WWF swooped in and made an unusual offer. DiBiase had once worked for the WWF when Vince Sr. ran the show, and there, Humble Ted held the North American Championship, the spiritual predecessor to the Intercontinental title. But this time, DiBiase would receive a much more substantial, much more colourful role. The caveat was that DiBiase would only learn what the gimmick was if he signed a deal with the WWF. As the story goes, the only hint as to what the gimmick was came from Pat Patterson, who told DiBiase that it was the role that Vince would give himself if he were a wrestler. After a bit of soul-searching, DiBiase bit the hook, and his faith paid off. Literally. Ted DiBiase became the $1 Million Man, the walking embodiment of 1980s greed, vanity, and materialism. Adorned in tuxedos and sporting a fistful of big bills, DiBiase proclaimed that he could buy anyone's morals or dignity because everybody had a price for the $1 Million Man. A declaration that he'd punctuate with a jackhammer-like belly laugh. And DiBiase lived the gimmick. To get the character over, McMahon gave DiBiase pocketfuls of spending money and allowed him to live in style on the road via special travel and hotel accommodations, something the other boys understandably envied. DiBiase bought big and tipped big in front of others, lending credence to the fact that he was truly the $1 Million Man. Debut vignettes depicted DiBiase and brooding bodyguard Virgil going about everyday life, whimsically tempting middle-class folk with cold, hard cash in exchange for their better judgment. Whether it was the guy who ran the community swimming pool, or having the kid dribble the basketball, or making a familiar-looking woman bark like a dog, it seemed that everybody did have their price. For WWF fans, that money could have bought a lot of desserts. That spring, the company began producing official WWF ice cream bars through the Gold Bond Ice Cream Company in Green Bay. The formula for a tasty squared circle-oriented summertime treat was a layer of spongy cookie depicting the syrup-stamped likeness of a WWF superstar on top of a slab of vanilla ice cream on top of a layer of chocolate shell. The bars remained in grocers' freezers into the mid-90s, and their absence has been lamented by generations of fans since. Some fans of the time had a much different lamentation, though: the sudden split of an ascending tag team. Rick Martel and Tom Zenk seem to have banner days ahead of them as the Can-Am connection. Between Martel's in-ring savvy, Zenk's natural athleticism, and their collective lady killer good looks, Martel and Zenk were wading their way up the card on the babyface side of the fence. The Can-Ams routinely went over established duos like the Dream Team and Volkov and Sheik on house shows, before kicking off WrestleMania 3 with the victory over once upper mid-carders Don Morocco and Bob Orton. As spring turned to summer, Martel and Zenk feuded with Haku and Tama, the Islanders, who turned heel and aligned with Heenan. Some accounts have it that this was a building block feud for the good guys, who were being positioned to dethrone the Hart Foundation for the World Tag Team titles not too far down the line. On Thursday, July 9th, the Connection defeated the Islanders at an innocuous house show in Hartford, Connecticut. It was the last time the two ever teamed together. Without any notice, Zenk suddenly quit the WWF. Accounts differ as to what exactly happened. Martel claimed Zenk had an attitude issue that the company wasn't happy with, and Martel worked to try and straighten it out, to no avail. Zenk's story was that he was unhappy over Martel allegedly making more money than him, accusing Martel of making a side deal with the WWF for extra pay, a charge that Martel denies. Zenk's anger over what he felt were low payoffs and his apparent distrust towards his tag team partner led to him suddenly quitting. After attempts to bring Zenk back proved fruitless, the WWF decided to give Martel a new partner, the ever-reliable Tito Santana. A month after Zenk left, Santana saved Martel from an attack at the hands of the Islanders. Together, the two veterans became known as Strike Force. Zenk was gone, but certainly not forgotten. Though WWF protocol of the day was to discontinue on-air mentions of former talent, the company chose to run Zenk's name through the mud on TV for weeks after his exit. Martel, along with babyface announcers McMahon and Gorilla Monsoon, let it be known that Zenk was a quitter that just couldn't hack it in the big bad World Wrestling Federation. Less than 3 months after forming Strikeforce, Santana and Martel defeated the Hart Foundation in Syracuse to win the tag titles, after Martel forced Jim Neidhart to submit to his Boston Crab. A little bonus note, the Harts had actually lost the titles on August 10th to the Rougeau brothers at a house show in the Rougeau's native Montreal. The title change was never acknowledged on WWF television and was done solely so that Montreal TV news affiliates could get footage of the local hero's triumph and air it on their programs for the publicity. As for Strikeforce, Tag Team Gold wasn't all the new team was given. They also got some era-centric theme music, probably much to their consternation. That September, WWF released Piledriver, the wrestling album 2. Like its 1985 predecessor, Piledriver was a 10-track set of genre-spanning tunes, several of which became iconic theme songs, including the Honky Tonk Man and Demolition's self-titled tracks, and the Slick Helm Jive Soul Bro. The title track was sung by Coco Beware, and served as his theme music for a time. There was also Jimmy Hart's Crank It Up, which was the subject of an unusual storyline. The upbeat 80s rocker was supposed to go to his team the Hart Foundation, but babyface duo the Young Stallions stole the song for themselves, for reasons. And WWF got years worth of play out of Crank It Up, as every dark match babyface from the Ultimate Warrior to Dustin Rhodes to Tatanka took turns entering to it in something of an inexplicable rite of passage. Other songs were inexplicable in other ways. The aforementioned Strikeforce was saddled with Robbie Dupree's Girls in Cars, a soft rock love ballad that didn't exactly strike fear. A modified instrumental was given to Santana and Martel for their arena entrances, which, charitably, was a slight improvement. Most noteworthy is the track with Vince McMahon on vocals. Stand Back is about a man who gets tired of people holding him back in life and wants to do things his way. And when Vinnie Mac grunts out the lines, "I'm a man running wild, headed for the top, never slowing down, never gonna stop, and along the way you'll see a lot of men drop," one can only think of where the territorial game stood in 1987. Like Tito Puente on The Simpsons, Vince verbalized his upper hand in song form. Kinda catchy too. But not as catchy as Vince's live performance of Stand Back at the 1987 Slammy Awards. For those who complain that modern wrestling is too choreographed, remind yourself, sometimes it wasn't choreographed enough. Champion Hogan, almost 4 years into his historic reign, looked less out of place pretending to play the bass during the fiasco. And speaking of the Hulkster, 1987 was a lucrative year for the champ. Not only was he rich in gold and earnings, but he'd made some new friends as well. The Macho Man seemed to be auditioning for the role of 21st century schizoid man during the summer of 1987. Randy Savage's house show schedule alternated between unsuccessful challenges of heroic Hogan and battles with Rogues Gallery regulars like Gang, Hercules, Reed, and Race. While Hogan Savage was a money matchup, a different sort of money-making venture lay in turning Macho good. After all, about half of the crowd was cheering for him anyway. The other half was just waiting for permission in the form of a face turn. And Savage had his arch nemesis in Honky. Since veritably falling arse backwards into the IC title, the delusional Warbler declared himself to be the greatest intercontinental champion of all time, to which you'd think some of the prior champions would take exception. Savage took exception. Honky's extreme boasts turned Savage babyface as the dog days of summer came to a close. Around the same time, Savage even won the 16-man one-night King of the Ring tournament, downing in succession Volkov, Jim Brunzell, ex-ref Danny Davis, who coasted on 2 count-out wins to the semis, and finally, King Kong Bundy. Matching Macho up against Honky was a license to print money for so many reasons, and the two made for natural foils throughout their bankable house show run. Alas, Savage could not win the championship, either pinning Honky in non-title bouts or going to some screwy non-finish when the gold was at stake. One such screwy finish was aired on the October 3rd Saturday night's main event, when Savage had Honky dead to rights after landing his flying elbow smash. However, at the count of 2, Bret Hart deftly slid across the mat with an elbow strike to Savage, facilitating the cheap DQ. The Hart Foundation helped their fellow Jimmy Hart client beat Savage down in the aftermath. Then came a famous scene. Bret and the Anvil held Savage in place so that Honky could deliver a crowning blow via his acoustic equalizer. That's when Miss Elizabeth intervened, briefly getting Honky to halt his swing by throwing herself into the line of fire. Honky briefly held up, but any mercy came and went. To a shocked reaction from the crowd, Honky grabbed Liz and threw her to the canvas to get her out of the way. Elizabeth then ran to the locker room as Honky smashed Savage with the guitar. Moments later, Elizabeth re-emerged, leading Hogan by the arm. Hulk saw the 3-on-1 inside the ring, then hit the scene to clean house. Savage gathered his bearings quickly enough, aiding Hogan in sending the heels packing. Though they had been at odds, Savage offered his hand to Hogan as a gesture of appreciation. Very quickly, a full-blown friendship was on display, as Hogan and Savage professed shared admiration, expressed through all manners of exaggerated handshake. That night, the Mania met the Madness, merging to form the Mega Powers. As Hogan boldly opined, the combination of Hulkamania and Macho Madness may become the most powerful force in WWF history. The Mega Powers were quite the impressive force, though one could argue WWF's pay-per-view clout was considerably stronger. Some familiar events were about to join the WWF calendar over the year ahead, but their creations were not the result of kind intentions.